The corridors of Buckingham Palace have witnessed centuries of quiet power shifts, but few decisions have sent a shockwave through the royal household quite like the moment King Charles picked up his pen and drew a decisive line through the official garden party hosting sheet. Sitting alone at his mahogany desk, surrounded by the heavy silence of his private study, the king stared at the document before him as though its weight surpassed that of the crown itself. For weeks, meticulous plans have been arranged for one of the most visible public displays of royal unity, the annual Royal Garden Party. Hundreds of distinguished guests, community leaders, and foreign dignitaries were scheduled to walk the palace grounds, expecting to see a seamless front of royalty. Camilla was intended to stand directly by his side, smiling to the handshakes, greeting guests, and reassuring the world that the core of the monarchy was unshakable. In the grand architecture of royal public affairs, hosting isn't merely about exchanging polite pleasantries over tea. It is an official map of trust, visibility, and proximity to the throne. The precise order of who greets which group of guests signals to every courtier, politician, and media watcher exactly where power resides inside the palace walls. Yet, after lingering on Camilla's name for several agonizing seconds without uttering a single word, Charles lowered his pen and made an unprecedented choice. He officially removed Camilla from her primary garden party hosting duties and reassigned the central reception responsibilities to another senior royal figure. Under the strict rules of royal protocol, the unwritten yet ironclad laws governing rank, decorum, and ceremonial hierarchy, this was far more than a routine schedule adjustment. It was a formal boundary. It was a king declaring that the royal stage would not be used as a platform for mounting personal tension, private pride, or competing internal influences. When the news was brought to Camilla in her private sitting room by a senior palace aide, her expression froze into a wounded kind of stillness before her voice could even articulate a reply. She remained perfectly upright, her posture rigid, listening to the aide explain that the adjustment was strictly tied to palace tone, public optics, and institutional control. Camilla understood every subtle nuance of those terms. Tone referred to the emotional temperature of the gathering. Optics meant how the sharp eyes of the international press would interpret every glance and gesture. Control meant that King Charles no longer trusted the current arrangement to remain harmonious. The closed door of that sitting room marked a seismic shift. Charles had not simply altered the schedule to fill an operational gap. He had executed a deliberate royal correction, and every courtier close enough to feel the fallout knew the palace ground had moved beneath their feet. However, the true shock surrounding this decision was not merely that Camilla had been sidelined. The deeper, far more staggering revelation was that contingency plans detailing her reduced role had been drawn up in secret days before she was ever informed, and even before the final fiery confrontation took place. Sitting in a secure administrative file were official draft documents outlining precisely how to scale back her ceremonial visibility without triggering an immediate public scandal. That meant senior figures within the royal household foresaw the crisis unfolding long before the fateful private luncheon, where the internal break became irreversible. The existence of those draft files prior to Camilla's knowledge revealed a stark truth. The palace machinery was already preparing to shield the crown from her influence. To understand why the king felt compelled to act so drastically, one must look back to a private luncheon held in the palace breakfast room just days prior. The gathering had been arranged specifically to finalize the greeting sequence for the garden party guests, a task that seems simple on the surface, but carries immense political weight within royal life. Receiving lines determine status, and status dictates power. During the discussion, it was revealed that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been placed ahead of Camilla for a key segment of the guest reception line to emphasize long-term institutional continuity before the public. When Camilla noticed the structural shift on the seating chart, the atmosphere in the room turned ice cold. She did not immediately raise her voice, but questioned the arrangement with a tight, sharp composure that made everyone at the table intensely uncomfortable. Prince William, present at the lunch, spoke up with measured calm, asking that the strategic order remain in place for the stability of the institution. But to Camilla, this was not about protocol. It was a direct personal displacement, a painful reminder that a younger generation was being elevated while her own standing was being quietly trimmed. Tension peaked when Camilla set her teacup down with enough force to kill the surrounding conversation dead. Looking across the table at Charles and William, she delivered a quiet yet devastating line. Perhaps the public should know who is really running this family. Those words carried the danger of a match struck in a room full of dry paper, leaving Charles with a stark realization that the upcoming garden party could easily devolve from a majestic display of unity into an open arena of competing pride. The heavy silence that settled over breakfast room following Camilla's sharp ultimatum was not the kind that vanishes with polite excuses. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that marks the exact moment a private disagreement transforms into an institutional crisis. King Charles remained completely still in his seat, his hand resting lightly near his teacup, staring at the polished table surface as the full weight of her words sank in. Beside him, Prince William did not react with visible anger, but his jaw set firmly, his eyes fixing on the detailed reception schedule lying between them. In the high-stakes environment of the British monarchy, a threat to reveal internal power struggles to the public is the ultimate breach of boundary. It is the one line that cannot be uncrossed, because the entire architecture of the modern crown relies on the appearance of dignified unity and unbroken continuity. Charles knew that if the upcoming royal garden party became a backdrop for subtle coldness, exchanged glances, or deliberate snubs captured by long-lens cameras, the damage to the crown's image would be immediate and irreversible. The luncheon concluded without an explosive shouting match, but the quiet aftermath was far more dangerous. As the family members dispersed, Charles asked the senior advisors to leave the room, opting to sit alone with the hosting folder for nearly 10 painful minutes. In those solitary moments, the husband gave way to the sovereign. When he finally summoned his private secretary back into the study, his demeanor had hardened. The order was given. The garden party hosting list was to be officially restructured. Camilla's primary ceremonial receiving position was to be reassigned, and a revised schedule was to be drawn up immediately under strict confidentiality. What followed was a confrontation behind closed doors that redefined the dynamic between the king and the queen consort. When Camilla entered Charles's private study shortly after the administrative order was finalized, she did not find a hesitant partner seeking reconciliation. She found the King of England seated behind his desk, flanked by official state papers, his face etched with profound, weary resolve. He did not stand as she walked in, a subtle shift in posture that instantly signaled the formal nature of the encounter. Positioned squarely in the center of the desk was a revised hosting sheet, signed and stamped with royal approval. Camilla stared at the document, her shock rapidly turning into deep indignation. She demanded to know if this drastic reduction of her role was a direct punishment for a single tense moment at lunch, asking whether years of standing loyally by his side through public hostility and relentless press scrutiny could be erased so casually over a disagreement on seating protocols. Charles looked at her with the heavy sadness of a monarch who understands that every decision made for the crown carries a personal cost. He explained in a measured, unyielding tone that this was not an act of malice or personal retaliation. It was a necessary shield constructed to protect the monarchy from a visible public fracturing. He told her that when private pride begins to threaten the dignity of an official state event, the institution must always take precedence over personal feelings. But for Camilla, the explanation offered no comfort. Beneath the hurt, a colder realization began to take hold. She asked Charles directly if Prince William had driven this decision, questioning whether the heir to the throne was quietly asserting his authority over the household's operational direction. The king paused, refusing to offer a simple denial or the easy reassurance she sought. That prolonged silence spoke louder than any formal statement could, confirming Camilla that the shift in power was not merely about one afternoon in the palace gardens, but about the long-term hierarchy of the royal family. Meanwhile, deep within the administrative offices of Buckingham Palace, the decision had already set off a chain reaction among courtiers and logistic staff. Changing an official hosting order for a major royal event is not simply a matter of swapping names on a piece of paper. It involves intricate adjustments to security details, arrival sequences, press positioning, and guest movement. Senior aides were instructed to execute the changes under the umbrella of official protocol updates, avoiding any internal gossip or speculation. Yet, inside a tightly guarded file folder, a second document was circulated among top household officials, a contingency plan that had been drafted days prior to the luncheon confrontation. This paper outlined step-by-step procedures on how to manage guest flow and media exposure in the event that Camilla's public duties needed to be abruptly scaled back. The existence of this contingency file proved beyond doubt that senior court advisors had already identified mounting friction and had quietly prepared the king to act before the situation spiraled out of control. When staff received the updated instructions, the mandate was crystal clear. The new arrangement was final, non-negotiable, and to be implemented without exception. As the news spread through restricted channels, Camilla withdrew to her private suite, isolated herself from the bustling corridors of the palace. The gloves were removed slowly, placed on a side table as she sat in silence, contemplating the stark reality of her new standing. She had endured decades of public vilification, fought her way into acceptance, and ultimately achieved the title of Queen Consort, only to realize that within the palace walls, proximity to the throne does not guarantee absolute immunity or permanent control. In his study, Charles remained alone long after her departure, torn between his deep affection for his wife and his sacred duty to the crown, fully aware that in choosing the institution, he had opened a profound emotional rift at the very heart of his personal life. When the morning sun rose over Buckingham Palace on the day of the royal garden party, the machinery of the state was already in motion, operating with a smooth, disciplined precision that concealed the emotional wreckage of the preceding days. Outside the wrought iron gates, gathering crowds of well-wishers and tourists held up morning newspapers whose front-page headlines had already seized upon the story. Speculation had leaked into the public sphere, framed not as a chaotic brawl, but as a subtle, decisive restructuring of royal duty. Broadcast crews positioned along the perimeter dissected every detail, noting the unusual absence of Queen Camilla's name from the official media reception guidelines. The palace press office had issued a characteristically cold, terse statement describing the schedule as a reflection of the king's personal wishes and the evolving ceremonial needs of the institution. To the trained observer, the phrase ceremonial needs was a clear diplomatic code. It signaled that the crown had stepped in to enforce order where private harmony had failed. Inside the residence, King Charles prepared for the long afternoon ahead, dressing with deliberate care. He knew that from the moment he stepped onto the immaculate manicured lawn, every single movement, pause, and glance would be scrutinized by hundreds of cameras and thousands of eyes searching for fractures in the royal facade. When he finally emerged onto the terrace, his face was a mask of controlled, gracious composure, yet the heavy exhaustion beneath his eyes told a different story. Beside him stood Prince William, composed, vigilant, and fully aligned with the king's direction. Camilla took her place further down the receiving hierarchy, executing her duties with flawless poise and unyielding dignity. But the emotional distance between her and the center of the event was unmistakable. She greeted invited guests, smiled for photographs, and exchanged polite pleasantries, yet the radiant enthusiasm that usually marked her public appearances had been replaced by a quiet, protective reserve. She understood now that the boundary drawn by Charles was not a temporary reprimand, but a permanent recalibration of her standing within the royal household. Behind the scenes, the true weight of the decision resonated in a private conversation between Charles and William once the crowds had dispersed and the palace gates were closed. Standing together in the quiet sanctuary of the king's private sitting room, father and son confronted the long-term reality of what had transpired. Charles confessed the immense personal strain of having to choose the crown over the peace of his own home, acknowledging the deep wound the decision had inflicted upon his marriage. William listened with quiet respect, offering no celebration or sense of personal victory. The prince recognized that the strength of the monarchy lies not in satisfying personal pride, but in its uncompromising commitment to duty and stability. He reassured his father that the sacrifice made that day was necessary to preserve the public trust that holds the entire institution together. William saw with absolute clarity that the crown must always protect itself first, even if it requires making agonizing cuts close to home. As the sun set over London, the ultimate lesson of the garden party became clear to all who lived within the palace walls. The crisis was never truly about a seating chart, a receiving line, or a cup of tea set down too hard, a private luncheon. It was about the eternal, unyielding struggle between personal emotion and royal responsibility. King Charles had demonstrated that when forced to choose, he would always prioritize the crown over personal comfort. Camilla had learned the harsh truth that holding a title does not grant immunity from the institutional machine. Prince William had witnessed the precise, painful discipline required to govern a modern monarchy. The garden party concluded, the guests departed, and silence returned to the halls of Buckingham Palace, leaving behind a clear, unshakable verdict. The crown had spoken, and even those closest to the throne had no choice but to obey.